So what we're going to be creating for our final project is a direct mail postcard. In the advertising world, direct mail has a very specific purpose and specific intent. There we go. It's a lot different than just your standard junk mail, right? Like we all get well, I shouldn't say we all, but we should all be pretty familiar with, the cheap paper circulars that come around, or, random postcard for, I don't know, Tim Hortons, whatever, with a coupon, all that fun stuff. So that's pretty much your standard junk mail, right? Direct mail is something a little bit different. Still essentially junk mail, but it's tailored to a specific audience, right? So if you are a customer, like I recently got one from Sullivan Tire, because I go to Sullivan Tire, and I get, their postcards or whatever for whatever, $10 off an oil change. But I wouldn't get that if I'm not a customer, right? They can also be really, really specifically targeted. In my experience, when I was working for an advertising agency, specifically dealing with high-end vehicle sales, I would do things like this very often, where we would do a direct mail postcard with like a new model of, like in this case, for this example, there's a new model. This is all theoretical. New model of the active hybrid X6. So BMW wants to get into the hybrid scene, right? So what they would do is they would, a dealership would go through, obviously have a script to do this, so you're not having like a person go through all this, but they would go through their customer list and who's coming off lease, or who's, if they would look for, someone that's nearing lease completion, or someone that, bought a car a few years ago and might be looking for a new car. You know what I mean? So they gather their information however they would want to gather it. And instead of sending it to every single customer, right? So if somebody just signed a lease less than a year ago, it would probably not be in their best interest to send it to that customer, because if they're not even a year into a 3-year lease, obviously they're not going to, well, they may or may not, but obviously they're generally not going to jump into a brand new thing, right? Like you're not in the market for a new car. So they go through their data and their statistics to find a specific audience to pitch this new model to. And again, since it's a direct mail and it's a more focused audience, you have a bit more reading time too. So if you think about when you go to the mailbox and you get your junk mail, like how often are you, how long are you spending on looking at a lot of these things? You might go, a fraction of a second, right? Nope, junk, bill, yeah, whatever. So, but if you had this targeted, I know, BMW Bangor, like, oh yeah, I'm just, you might spend a little bit more time looking at, you have a little bit more reading time, you have a little bit more audience time. A lot of companies as well, we used to do this quite frequently, would do odd sizes to get more attention than your standard postcard. If you have something that's a little bit bigger. In this case, we're going to be doing a jumbo mailer, which is an actual thing. It's 6x11, so that's a rather large postcard. So you might see this in your mailbox and go like, oh, what is like? It at least gives you another sort of fraction of a second probably to grab your audience, which is super important in advertising, right? So that's where direct mail differs from just your standard sort of junk mail. Direct mail is targeting and to a specific tailored audience, generally based on statistics of whoever is sending it out, or whoever's basically selling this product. So that's what we're going to be doing for this assignment. I'm not going to go over this word for word, but we're going to be creating a postcard for direct mail services. Again, an intended target audience. It's our job as a designer to determine this audience and pitch the ad to the client accordingly. Essentially, a postcard is an advertisement, right? So the client is the BMW Auto Group. The look of the postcard needs to reflect the attitudes of the client and the perceived target audience. What that basically means is we're going to be doing a little bit of research. What that basically means is reflecting the attitudes of the client, right? Like BMW has certain looks. They have certain elements that they include, or, they're not as, and we'll see as we go through some of the examples, but like BMW does get funny. They do get creative. They're still, relatively corporate, relatively clean, but they involve a lot more humor in their ads, and I use the term loosely. They involve a lot more humor in their ads than, say, like Mercedes. Mercedes is generally pretty dead serious with their approach and with their presentation, right? So definitely, the attitudes of somebody like BMW in the higher end auto industry would be very different from like Ford and, for those of you that know them, like the Dennis Leary voiceovers that they do for their trucks, and they have that very aggressive, truck commercials and things like that. So think about these kind of things, right? So we have, I'll go over it. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to be introducing the new Active Hybrid X6, which is totally made up, or it might not be now. A new vehicle introduced by BMW, who regards itself as a company that sets the trends in the luxury automobile industry. And then the following example is a sample from the X line description. So this is basically for they have, for those of you that are not familiar, they have different models, different lines of models. So this is an excerpt from the X line. I'm not going to read this. You guys can read this on your own. The X line. We'll go over this as well. I should probably click on these so we actually see these. So you'll kind of see how we're getting more specific. And I'll go over some specifics of the assignment here. But this is absolutely true. BMW regards itself as a company that sets the trends in the automobile industry. They're always, every auto company likes to think of themselves as the innovator, right? They want to be the first to do, it's the sort of weapons race. They want to be the first to whatever. But BMW, most of the higher end luxury manufacturers do sort of set the trends and set those innovative things, because it starts with, you have a client base that essentially has a ton of disposable income. Like, what kind of cool bells and whistles can you add? But BMW also regards itself as trendsetters because of their performance aspect, because of their technological advances and things like that eventually generally, as I've seen, get adopted more widely by other companies, and they tend to adopt their advances in the auto industry, be it a lot of times simple as like body design and aerodynamics. Sometimes it's something super technological. Sometimes it's whatever it is. The sports activity coupe, they talk about this sort of crossover SUV, SAV thing. Like, they were somebody will probably correct me, but they were one of the first to do this sort of like crossover SUV thing. And then now pretty much every single company has, your whatever they call it, but the crossover SUVs, that kind of thing. So to get into some more of the technical information, our card size, as I said, is going to be 6 inches high by 11 inches wide, with a 1/4 inch bleed on all sides and 1/4 inch margins. We're going to be setting that up in InDesign when you open your document. I can go over it quickly at the end of this, but we should all know how to do this at this point. You will have to be aware of the trim area. We've talked about it a little bit, but this time we're going to be actually working with. So we're going to be concerned about trim and bleed, and safe zone, which is what these margins are essentially going to be. So we have our finish size, the trim, which is where physically the card gets cut down, is 6 by 11. The 1/4 inch bleed is set up to where it's going to be a 1/4 inch on all sides. It's going to be a 1/4 inch bigger than 6 by 11 on all sides. The bleed refers to if you have graphics, any kinds of color, any kind of image, anything that goes to the edge of your card, to the edge of your print. You want it to expand beyond just the 6 by 11. You want to give yourself a little wiggle room, because when these are produced, there's a tendency, not all printers are perfect. It's paper, they shift. 1/4 inch bleed is a pretty loose tolerance. Generally, they're a bit tighter than that, but I'm giving you guys a little bit of extra wiggle room, I guess. But that basically ensures that, like, let's say you have a blue graphic that goes directly to the edge of your paper. If you just make it 11 wide, there's a chance that your paper could shift a little bit in printing and cutting, and then you end up with like a white strip on one side, and obviously that's not something that you want. So if you have this bit of extra, 1/4 inch, so it's really a 1/2 inch total, but a 1/4 inch on both sides, and you expand it into your bleed, then that ensures that if it shifts a little bit, it still cuts and you still have your edge-to-edge print, right? And I'll go over more specifics as well of that. The safe zone or safe area, some printers call it different things, but basically your safety area is going to be that 1/4 inch margin. So it's going to be a 1/4 inch in from your trim. And basically that ensures that when you have safe zones or whatever the producer calls it, if you have things, they generally have their tolerances, and they know their tolerances. They usually give you an inset safe zone inside of that tolerance, so that, again, if you have shifts, like if you have text or any important information and it's like right to the edge of that 11 inches wide, again, there's a chance that it could shift and like the start of an address could get cut off. But if you have something within that safe zone, it still is well within their tolerances, and you don't run into any chance of that getting cut off. And again, it'll make more sense when I actually show you some examples. So that's what our margins are effectively going to be. We're going to set this margin as a visual guide for our safe zone. So anything that you include, any kind of important information that you want to have within your direct mail piece is going to need to fall within that 1/4 inch margin to ensure that nothing potentially gets cut off. I just said all that. So we're going to come up with, I should add at least, but we're going to come up with 2 initial designs for critique. If you come up with more, awesome. But you're going to have at least 2 initial designs, rough drafts, or rough-ish drafts, to critique a little bit. And then based on the critiques, we're going to revise one for our final design. So we're going to have a second part to this assignment. And we're going to save them and upload them to the last name BMW cards. You can have, some people choose to do this differently. There were people last semester when I did this, some people saved, they just opened a 2-page document and had both of their rough ideas on one document. Some people chose to save them on separate documents just to have them, so if you do choose to have both of your designs in one document, you can have it saved as last name BMW cards. Or if you choose to do it in 2 different documents, which is totally fine, just make sure you have like BMW card A, B, or 1 or 2. You know what I mean? Mark them differently so I know that they're 2 different drafts. And then you're going to have the last name. When you have your final, you're going to save it as a totally new document and have it as your card final, so that I have your roughs as a separate document and then your finals as a separate document. I don't want you editing your rough and saving over it, right? So in the end, you're going to have 2 rough drafts and 1 final as separate documents. And basically what's going to end up happening is our grading is going to be 50 points for our initial designs and then 50 points for the final revisions. So getting into the meat of this, trim and bleed. I know I just described it, but sometimes visuals, this is all the descriptions that we just talked about. So you have here is a good example of, and the font and the imagery is not great, but so you see we have here the design and then the print. This in particular does not have bleed. You can see it has a white border and the card gets cut here. But in this case, you have that safe zone. So they made sure that everything fell well within this safe zone. So when the card gets cut down, if there's any shift, none of this gets cut off. I did do, that sounded terrible. I did have a while back, I guess they're not new anymore, but I had some cards, some business cards made up for a client, and I had everything well within their safety zone and whatever, and when it came back, it essentially came back like this. They cut off however much, but too much, but they basically had it cut off like this, as if I had it set up outside of that safety zone like this one was, but I knew that it wasn't. So when I called the company, I said, hey, you cut off my text, I had it well within the safe zone, whatever, and the graphics person opened up my file right there and was like, well, look at that, you're right. I don't know what we did. Somehow they shifted it and whatever, so they reprinted them, obviously at no cost because it was their mistake. But if it was my mistake like this, so you have your safety, your trim, and your bleed. So here in our sample print, we have the image goes all the way to the edge of the card, right? So you want, if this blue is the trim, you want that image to extend beyond that trim, so when it cuts, you don't have an accidental white edge. But what they did here is they had their name and information go all the way to the bleed. I mean, even if it was up against the trim, you have the potential to have this get cut off. So that's why you want to have to make sure that this is nice and compact inside this safety zone. I'm not going to go over this word for word, but you get the idea. This is all from a company, Overnight Prints, which is actually pretty decent. And a lot of these companies too, depending on the company that you go with, depending on the format, depending on whatever, like business cards versus, I just recently designed some beer can labels. They had totally different tolerances. I've shown some examples of, not to get too off topic, let's go into, oops, that's not what I want. Let's go into this very quickly. I want to see if this, so like this, for example, this is a beer can label, but they have all of the, and theirs is in metric, but they have all of their different specs. And so generally every single, unless it's something completely custom and you're going with like sometimes even a local shop, but generally if it's a commercial printer that does whatever it is, stickers, labels, postcards, business cards, whatever, the companies will have templates, or they will have at least specs for you to set up. So they'll say like, our tolerances are an 1/8 inch for safety and bleed, so you want to have those. But in this case, this company had this template set up, and then they don't have specifically bleed, but because this is whatever, the process that this is, it ends up getting printed, folded, and glued, and then it's like a shrink wrap sleeve, essentially. So that's why they have this white border, because that's where the glue is going to go, and then this is the overlap. But this was their template, and I had this to design it within this template. So basically, like, here's the visual center on the can, and then here's where a fold is going to be, and here's where a fold is going to be, and then this part kind of lays flat-ish. Anyway, you get the general idea. So 9 times out of 10, a company is going to have, like, for example, Overnight Prints. Overnight Prints is going to have downloadable templates where they're going to have all of this set up. Or if not, they're going to at least have specifics for what their tolerances are, so that you can set up your document accordingly, much like we're going to do here. You know, here's our document information that we're going to set up, accordingly. So going into the specifics of BMW. So I have those examples. BMW in general, you can kind of see the sort of look of their imagery. There's like, this is very typically BMW. You know, sort of once you get familiar with sort of looking at and working with these things, you know, having this 3/4 front end action shot. You know, they're very into, most car designers are very into, I always forget the word, anamorphic. That's probably not the right word. Resembling human, like they have like the front end of cars, like a lot of car designers like to think of them as like resembling faces, kind of. You have this sort of attitude of a car. Anyway, so you have generally these nice, you know, 3/4 or even front on, and again 3/4 here, front shots as like a nice main shot at least, for their for their output, for their advertisements. They do have some hybrid information now, the X5, X-Drive 4.0, whatever. Anyway, and you can get into looking at the general website, and then specifically the X models. So you can see, you know, some of their terminology they like to use, versatility without limits, the philosophy of the X line. You know, while it might have all this cool stuff, above all, it's BMW. But I'd like you to do a little bit of research, look into this, to sort of get an idea for, I mean, you can even see, like, don't just drive, conquer. You know, you can kind of see some of the attitudes of the client in general. And again, this is sort of a more general, more general about the X series, but you can see we have the X1, and again, I won't go through the entire thing, but X2, X3, 4, 5 is when we get into like the sports activity vehicles, the first sports activity vehicle. They did it first. Sorry. And then the X6, which actually exists, and then for our fictional product, we're doing the X6 Active Hybrid. So basically a hybrid version of this car is our fictional product. But then as you can see, we get into specifically, I had some information about the X6, the Sports Activity Coupe, which is another registered, not trademark because that's something different, but anyway, it's another registered, protected term that BMW invented. So anyway, you get the idea. Basically, the X6 Active Hybrid is going to be pretty much all of this, and adding that sort of hybrid element, that fictional hybrid element to our new thing. But again, you can see they get a little bit tongue-in-cheek here and there, as much as a luxury car does. But this is just to give you guys some more information, to dig through, to get some of the attitudes, to also cherry pick some text if you want to. You can make up your own copy. You can borrow copy from any of these places. The only thing I will warn is if you're going to grab copy for the X6, if you're going to grab specific copy, even adding hybrid, let's say you wanted to focus on the interior or something like that, just make sure you're grabbing it from the right model, that you're grabbing it from the X6 instead of the X2. It's very easy to grab information from the wrong thing. But, again, feel free to use any of this copy for your designs. So I have this information just to show you guys, again, sort of give you guys some research materials to look into the client. It's one of the first things you want to do when you're working with a client is get some background on the client, right? And then, so some of these are older, some of these are scans, clearly. Some of these are better than others, which you'll see, and I'll sort of critique some of them as we go along. But a lot of these are going to look a little bit different too. You'll see, I'll go into specifics, but BMW has this very specific, their Rondell and the Ultimate Driving Machine. Our logo doesn't include that. You don't have to put it in there if you don't want to. But the one thing that you'll see is a constant is this white square. A lot of companies want free space around their logos, right? Like I did some work for Kia locally, and their design specs were around the Kia logo. They want the width of the height of the K, if that makes sense. So from here to here, let's pretend this is Kia. So from like here to here, let's say, needs to be, if you flipped the K on its side, it needs to be the same distance at least. You want to have clear space, the height of the K here, the height of the K here, and the height of the K here, just to ensure that you're not crowding their logo. What BMW did, and they've been doing this forever, what BMW did is they created this design element. I mean, obviously it's just a white square, but they created this design element to ensure that free space. So basically, anything other than this that crowds this white space is no good. And what ends up happening is if you do something where if you change this even if you change it to the model that you're doing, or the brand, or the dealership, if you change this main logo, or if you get rid of, you just get rid of the white space and you have something else right next to it and whatever, legitimately you get, if they have people that are entire teams that are dedicated to just searching this stuff out. If you don't adhere to their design guidelines, especially as a dealership, you get a written warning, and then after you get a written warning and you keep doing it, you actually get fined. So BMW corporate actually fines you for improperly using their branding. A lot of companies will do that. So that's why when you're working with a brand, it's very important to get their brand standards. So short story is BMW kind of created that created this to basically ensure that nobody crowds their logo kind of thing. So that way you have this, they built in that free space into their logo to sort of like hopefully ensure that people don't screw it up, basically. And then you'll see often they have the secondary, if you want to have other information. So this is a European dealership, but you have the European motors. Sometimes you'll see, sometimes it's a model number or something like that. So they'll have the secondary square so that you're not interfering with that logo. But I chose this one to start with first, even though it's a terrible scan, because you can sort of see some of the humor of BMW, but also because I think it's not a very good design as well. So you have here, you have the proud kid and I guess the friends, which you get if you read all of this copy, which is like a ton of copy. So you have here, this is technically the headline, how do you become the best daddy in the world? Just impress his friends. So you're kind of the cool dad because you bought this sweet BMW and the friends are all interested in it, I guess. The reason I feel that it's a poor design is because just by looking at it, especially if consider this, if this was our mailer, this is going to get completely lost. Your sort of your punchline is completely lost. Your headline gets buried. It's not, as we go through more, it's not very sort of BMW typical, which is why I would guess that this was an advertisement that was done in-house for Euro Motors, whoever that is. Because again, if it was designed by corporate, it would have their very, very corporate look, which we'll see. As a side note, we're not going to use it because it's a proprietary thing, but as a side note, BMW has its own version of Helvetica that they had designed, so it's slightly different than regular Helvetica. For the purposes of this, generally we're going to use regular Helvetica, it's fine. But you'll see here, BMW motorcycles, as I zoom in, it pixelates like crazy, but BMW motorcycles is a whole other division, and obviously you can see they kind of have a little bit more license to be even funnier, in air quotes. But you see, the new generation has arrived. They came out with a new generation of motorcycles, and they have, the typical biker tattoos on a baby, new generation, blah, blah, blah. But you can see they have the BMW Rondell with the motorcycle branding, and then the secondary logo or the secondary box with the model information. And then even here, this sort of tagline, it's not really a headline because it's at the bottom, but this sort of tagline is a little bit understated, but I feel like it works because you have this, this majority of an image. It's kind of funny, it's kind of eye-catching, and then the motorcycle in the corner. But you have the sort of tagline is separated. I feel like it could be a bit bigger, even if they pumped it up to about, give or take, even here. So you had that font even bigger leading you to the motorcycle. But it doesn't get buried like the other ones buried in the kid's shirt, and you don't even, you really don't even read it. It's not too bad. The way that this ad sort of moves, it leads the viewer's eye around the advertisement works. I feel like some minor tweaks, but I feel like overall it works. These are very much more typically BMW. So you have, generally your headline or your tagline, whatever you want to call it, because sometimes it's not just a header. And then you have, again, you can see your BMW logo and then your information about the 3 Series. But again, you can see using that safe space or that free space around the logo, that design element, which we're not cropping. You can certainly add to. You just have to make sure that nothing encroaches this white box. But if you wanted to have, I think there's examples of it, but if you wanted to have a white background with the BMW logo on it so it looks seamless, that's totally fine. You don't have to have the square. There's certainly times they use it where you don't actually see the square. Like if this was the black logo on the sort of darker background, as long as there's nothing within that free space, that's totally fine. But it would look seamless. And you'll see, obviously, these are the finishes, but you'll see, a lot of these have bleed, so the image would extend beyond what this trim is going to be. But you kind of see, again, they're sort of attitudes. Every car has this moment. This one has thousands per second, so they have this kind of like film strip kind of each moment, whatever. So doing this like thousandths per second, almost sort of frame rate, time-based medium frame rate reference. And then here, this one's a bit more obvious, but again, you can see the sort of somewhat typically BMW look. And then we also get into dealer specifics. I'm trying not to let these pixelate too much, but this one would be generally, if there's something like this, you can see how dated it is with the old iPod. But generally, if you have an advertisement that doesn't include the logos, you have to include the logo. Generally, I just grabbed this one section. This was probably part of a full page, and they broke it into two. It typically happens, you guys wouldn't know this, but they would have either probably above it or next to it, they would have another ad. Typically for, like, they would have a more corporate ad up top with the logo and the information and maybe the dealership information to the left. And then they would have this, which would be more specific information directly related to the dealer. But the reason I wanted to show you this one is for, you can have, again, fairly typically BMW, I would say minus the font choices. That's not to say you can't use other fonts, but in this case, I might use the Helvetica, the BMW look for at least the headline and maybe even this tagline. And then for all the other information, you can use all the other fonts you want. But I thought this was a good example of, like, it's very sort of postcard size-ish. But a good idea of, like, you have, again, the sort of typically BMW shot with, somewhat of the BMW setup. But then you have also these detail shots if you wanted to include details. And you have, your frames, a little bit of drop shadow on them to set them off a little bit. So we start getting into a little bit more, I wouldn't really say complex, but a little bit more complex graphics, and adding some more graphic elements to our designs here. And then again, another sort of corporate one. But you can see, again, they use a lot of these dynamic product shots. Again, obviously it's not hilarious, haha funny, but for a luxury brand, it's fairly funny. The closest you'll ever get to being in two places at the same time, I guess, obviously regarding their speed. The speed of the 3 Series, no, the M5. So things like that. Again, you don't typically, I guess now you would see it, but like generally a couple years ago, you wouldn't necessarily see somebody like Mercedes doing this. I feel like a lot of brands now are involving more humor than they used to, but typically for those luxury items or luxury brands, generally the humor is dry if it's there. Again, a little bit more sort of tongue-in-cheek. Again, reflecting the speed of the M series. I wanted to show this as well. So you have, again, very sort of typically BMW shot. You have the logo with the free space, but here we have a little bit of extra graphics, much like the inset designs of the other one. Using the M series and speaking to its power, you have this, this sort of translucent graphic in the background. I might have even pushed that a little bit more, a little larger across the whole thing, maybe to push that, make that bigger and make that sort of stand out. And you could even drop the transparency a little bit more and get away with it. But you get the general idea, adding a little bit more graphics. And then here is where I was speaking to the other design, where you would have, again, sort of a more, granted, while this has the dealership information, taking a full page spread and almost treating it as two different ads, where you have like the top is a little bit more corporate, and then the bottom has, the more inset graphics with some more graphic elements, using some transparencies with these graphic shapes, creating a little bit of movement, leading the eye around the ad, getting into the branding, the 3 Series, Again, some detail shots, repeating these graphic elements, adding the drop shadows, the outer glows, and then some more information, about the 3 Series, and then again the branding for the dealership. But again, a really good example of using some simple graphics and effects to create a more dynamic ad, but also keeping within sort of the attitudes of the client. And then here we have some student examples. So you'll see how we have this set up. We have bleed, and this was for another class, obviously, but so we have the safety, what will be the trim rather, and then the bleed. So I'm gonna see, obviously, since we're gonna be working in InDesign, I'm gonna be looking at your working files and not the output. But you can see again, pretty simply stated, you have, the somewhat typical BMW shot, your vehicle information, your tagline, the logo, not messing around with that free space. The other thing too is when you're sizing, you want to either make sure that you're using your scale tool to where you're inputting, to where you're inputting your scale. So if you wanted it to be 90% or 120%, whatever. If you are going to be using your selection tool to scale your items, make sure you are holding shift. That's a huge thing. I know we've talked about it in the past. You don't want to be distorting photos. Definitely don't want to be distorting logos. So keep in mind that your ratios are still staying the same. Your vertical and horizontal ratios are still staying at 100%. So that's where using the scale tool comes in handier than sometimes if you just grab a corner and scale, and if you either forget to hit shift or you let go of shift prematurely or whatever. You just want to make sure that you're not squishing logos and not squishing images. But again, you see simple graphic. We have a sort of transparent gradient bar here to give you a little bit of space for the text to pop out. It works well with the image. And then you have these details with some nice rounded corners to give you a little bit of detail shots. My sort of quick critiques of this is I might make this whole top bar a little bit smaller, move this card down a little bit. It's a touch crowded. Maybe make this a little bit bigger, and again this a little bit bolder and bigger, and maybe even move it over to the right a little bit to sort of give it a little bit more dynamic flow. Even swap these two, but that's kind of personal preference-ish. I see what they were doing. They have they wanted to introduce the brand literally and then have their tag. So I would have this tag be a little bit bigger maybe. But again, good use of graphics to create the ad. And then here, so we have typically here, going green has never been so beautiful. And then creating this, in the actual file, the blacks sort of match more, so this is a little bit more seamless. But creating this black background for these detail shots, to pop out a little bit more. Again, the sort of quick critique is I might move this over to the left just a little bit so this area here isn't so crowded. And then again, make this a little bit bigger, even, again, having this more lined up, justified right-ish, have this push this over justified left-ish just to give it that sort of more sort of typically BMW dynamics. But here is where I was talking about when you have, again, these blacks match up the PDF, or the JPEG is not showing it well, but you can see how they still kept the free space around the logo, but they had a black on black background, so when it actually matches up, this looks like it's just the BMW logo on this giant black background, which is totally fine to do as long as there's nothing within this area. You're totally fine to do that. So it looks, if you want a more seamless look, like this ad. So they did that same thing, and you can kind of see where they had it nudged just a touch over that line there, where this card actually ends here. This shot is just a bad screenshot, but you can see they wanted that sort of just white white edge all along the edge, but they still have that, generally here is that BMW free space, but it looks fairly seamless. And again, if you want to recreate that, the logo that I provided doesn't have the Ultimate Driving Machine in there. If you want to recreate that, you're welcome to. Just make sure it looks pretty much exactly like the other one. You don't have to, certainly. But again, here is a really good example of graphics. This is this sort of weird carport roof thing. Without the white background would be very hard to get text over. Whenever you have an image that has a huge mix of light and dark and all this linear action going on, almost any color of text is not going to read well. So this is a great way to incorporate some simple sort of dynamic graphics and then the repeating graphic here, and then adding a pop of color, just a little bit of color to set that off a little bit. My minor critique about this would be potentially a different shot, or having at least one detail, because generally you typically don't have like a rear three-quarter shot as the only image. Generally dealerships or auto manufacturers like to see the front of the car, like that's the whole, obviously they like all of the car, but typically you would see the front. If it's a single shot, you would see the front of the vehicle. And then again, lastly, using a similar image, these were, I'm 99% positive this was the same student, but you can kind of see a little bit, it pixelates a bit, but a little bit of a different treatment, a little bit of a typo here, but you can see how not having any kind of graphic behind that text, you can see how hard it is to read over a very sort of color and element dynamic image, where almost any color over this is going to be hard to read. But again, not badly designed. You have this sort of letterboxing, black bars at the top and the bottom to sort of give it a bit of a frame. And then I liked the use of this simple line graphic to sort of frame it out even more, give it a little bit more of a dynamic look. Again, sort of the critiques I would have for this would be the logo's a bit big. It's kind of large in this design. Even moving it down to this area here, if they wanted to have it down, and then this gives you more room if you wanted to pull this box down a bit and have the top black bar wider, so you could put white on black text here to make that stand out a lot more, and again have that sort of more sort of typical, in this case something like that, the more typical BMW-ish look. Moving this down a bit gives you a bit more room to bring down this black bar again, and then have this bottom bar even be a little bit smaller to sort of offset that balance. The other thing that we're going to be considering too is our typical design elements. A design that reads well, literally and visually. You want to have a design that's balanced. When we talked about things like negative space, think about your typical, your typical design elements. So if you had a larger black box here, which is essentially negative space, and then balance that out with having maybe a thinner black bar at the bottom, and then still keeping these thin bars, that gives you a little bit of room to bump these two down to get sort of give a little bit more breathing room around the car. But again, you can see all of these design elements go well beyond the bleed. Everything is well within the safe area. You have the logos, especially this design in particular. Everything is way well within that safety area. So if this were to trim, even if this were to go into the safety area, there's nothing that really would get, that's terribly important that would get super cut off. But you can see again with these bars and even these simple graphics here, everything extends well beyond. Everything extends well beyond the bleed, so that you get that edge to edge graphic printing. So these are just some examples, again, some student examples and some corporate examples, to just show you, again, give you some ideas, but also show you start to at least show you some of the sort of typical BMW things. And again, on your own, you can research. If you just search, BMW ads. Again, do a little bit of research at first to get a general sense of what people do, or what different, whether BMW corporate, you can find ads on their main website, or even just what other dealerships have done, just to sort of get a general sense of, the sort of typical-ish BMW thing, what they do, how they present themselves. So generally, you can stick within that, attitude and represent the brand properly. All right, questions? I know that was a lot of information to throw at you, but all right. So again, very quickly, I will show you. So we have our new document. I don't have that. We can set this up in inches. I don't have it in inches, and I have the old version. So what we're going to be doing, again, if you want to have both designs on one page, you can set up your number of pages, and you can uncheck facing pages as we get the beach ball. There we go. So you can uncheck facing pages, and you'll see, well, it's just going to show us one page now. So we have the number of pages is 2, the start page is going to be 1, and then this way we're going to have two completely separate pages. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do 6, bless you, make sure I type inches. Oh, I have it wrong. 11 inches wide by 6 inches high. And then columns you don't necessarily have to worry about. If you would like to set up columns, just to going back to that first grids assignment, it's not necessarily necessary for a postcard. So we don't really need to worry about the columns and the gutter. Here is where we're going to set up our margins. So we're going to have our 1/4 inch margins, and that will set your margins all around. And then here, so we're going to set our bleed. And the slug, which we didn't necessarily get into, but the slug is generally for preview purposes. I don't know if you've ever seen like a production ad. Like sometimes they'll have a slug at the bottom. It'll be like 1/2 inch, and they'll have like the information, like the file name, color information, sometimes who it was designed by, what publication it's going to run in, things like that. So I can bring in an example of that if you want to see that. So that's generally what the slug info is. It's usually like an extra bit. It's not necessarily attached to the document at all, but it's when you open the InDesign file, it's usually a spot where people can put in any relevant information to, like, again, publication, designer, color, instructions, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, we're just going to be concerned with the bleed. So we're going to set our 1/4 inch bleed, and now you can see we have our bleed lines here. And then we're going to hit OK. And then as I zoom out, now you can see we have our 2 different designs in one document. If you want to set it up this way, that's totally fine. If you wanted to set it up as 2 separate documents for whatever reason, absolutely acceptable, as long as I have your 2 designs. So again, going into like, consider this the safety area, this is the trim, this is the bleed. I'm not going to go through too much of this, but if you have, again, with that black bar at the top, let's say, you have your shape, or fill, and you wanted that to print all the way to the edge of the top and the sides. You just want to make sure you want to have that at least to the bleed. You can have it, I tend to, I don't know, I'm really particular with my design. So I typically have mine like exactly to the bleed. Some people, and again, it doesn't really matter. As long as it's at least to the bleed, like some people just kind of like randomly, like they'll just sort of arbitrarily draw, like I just want this line, as long as this is generally a 1/4 inch, let's say, and they might even have like this side is that long. As long as it extends beyond the bleed, it doesn't matter how far it extends. I typically tend to, like I said, I have it right to the edge of my bleed just because for me it looks cleaner. It's like when people clean up code, people talk about code looking nicer than other code. Like, I don't get it, but I get that people like nice, whatever. Because nobody's ever going to see this except for the designer. So sometimes when I open up a file that I'm printing for somebody else and it's all off like that, like it's like, I want to fix it so bad, but it's like, it's not my fault. But anyway, as long as it extends to the bleed, at least, again, anything that extends beyond, it's not going to get printed anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And then again, when you're placing elements or, consider your frames, your graphics, again, that, don't squish any logos or any car images or things like that. I really just wanted to show you that setup.